So there's no notes. Oh, well, fortunate for you, I have my notes from this time.
Good afternoon and welcome to the June Acreage and Grain Stocks Briefing. My name is Lance Honig and I serve as chair of the Agricultural Statistics Board at NASS. This briefing is for the Secretary of Agriculture and other policymakers of the USDA to better understand the content and context of today's reports. We're very pleased to have Dr. Seth Meyer, USDA's chief economist, join us as Secretary Designate today. Dr. Meyer, I'd like to share that, as you can see, we've got quite a few visitors with us today. Our good friend Mark Ray has brought in a group of the folks that are part of the Demmer Scholars Internship Program. And somewhere in here, we've even got a couple of folks from the Office of Tribal Relations. So welcome to everybody here today. Before I turn things over to our presenter, I do have a few notes for our live streaming audience. The Acreage and Grain Stocks reports are considered principal federal economic indicator reports. The Office of Management and Budget provides specific guidance on how these important reports are to be released. OMB statistical policy instructs policymaking officials to refrain from making public comment regarding the content of these reports within 30 minutes of their release. Therefore, we will not be taking questions from the public during this briefing. NASS staff are available for phone or email questions, and NASS will host a social media event at 1:30 Eastern Time today. We strive to have everything presented at this briefing match the official record. However, should there be any discrepancy, always refer to the official published estimates. With that, I'll turn things over to Anthony Perlman. He is the acting chief of the NASS Crops Branch. Anthony?
Well, thanks, Lance, and good afternoon. I too want to welcome everyone who is in the room today, as well as those who are joining online. Obviously, this is June. We have a lot of information to share, so we're going to go ahead and jump right into it. Now, before we get to the numbers in today's report, let's first look at the two surveys we conducted to establish the estimates. The first is our June agricultural survey, which is a farmer-reported survey. The sample size was nearly 68,000 and data was collected starting May 30th through June 16th. Now, for this survey, farmers were asked to report the total acres they operate, acreage for each commodity of interest, as well as the amount of grain and rice they had stored on their farming operation as of June 1st. Now, the other survey we conducted was the All-Farm Grain Stock Survey, which accounts for all grain stored in commercial facilities. There were approximately 7,900 of those facilities across the country, and we collected data from them between June 3rd and June 16th. Now, the map on this slide shows how the June Ag Survey samples are distributed across the U.S. As you can see, the larger sample sizes represented by the darker shade are in the major producing areas of the country. Now, as we have done the last several years, we are highlighting the amount of corn and soybean acres that were still left to be planted when we were conducting the survey. Most of the country experienced fairly good planting conditions this year, so the amount of corn and soybeans left to be planted is in line with what we have seen in previous years with similar planting conditions. Farmers reported that 3.63 million acres of corn and 11.5 million acres of soybeans were left to be planted during the time of data collection. Now, before we look at the individual crops, we like to start by looking at the principal crops total to see that big picture of what is happening across all the crops this year. Now, this total is simply the sum of the 22 major crops that are listed in that blue box at the bottom of the slide. Based on our current estimates, the principal crops total for 2025 is estimated at nearly 311 million acres. This is up 0.3% or 899,000 acres from what we estimated back in March in the prospective plantings report, but it's down 0.1% or 370,000 acres from the previous season. Now, looking at the principal crop acres graphically across the past 10 seasons, you can see how this year's total of 310.8 million compares historically. Next, we'll look at the principal crops total by state. Let me give a quick overview of how to read this map since we will use this same layout throughout the presentation. The top number in each state represents the value as indicated in the title. For this map, this is the state's principal crops total for 2025. The bottom number represents the percent change from either the previous estimate or the previous year. This map is comparing back to March. States colored in blue are showing an increase from the previous estimate or year, whereas the states colored in red are showing a decrease. And then the darker the shade, the greater the percent change. Now, if you see a pound sign beside the top number, that represents a record high for the state, whereas an ampersand represents a record low. So comparing the principal crop totals back to March, we see a mixed bag of states increasing and decreasing. But as you can see, most of the changes are less than 5%. Now, there is one state record on the map, that is Alaska. They are up from their March intentions, but as you will see on the next slide, they are equal to last year. Now, we do have some record lows. We're seeing that in Maine, South Carolina, and New Jersey. Now, here's the map comparing this year's principal crop totals to last year. As you can see, like the previous map, we see year-to-year changes of less than 5% in most states. All right, we'll now start looking at the individual crops. We'll start with corn. Now, this graphic shows this year's planting progress compared to the previous 5 seasons. This data comes from our weekly crop progress and conditions survey, and 2025 is represented by the red line. Now, looking across this time frame, you can see how this year compares to the previous 5 years. And as the chart indicates, there was nothing really abnormal with planting this year since conditions were fairly good in most areas of the U.S. this spring. Now, looking at the corn acreage numbers in today's report, planted acreage is estimated at 95.2 million acres. This is down 0.1% or 120,000 acres from the March intentions, but up 5.1% or 4.61 million acres from what was planted last year. Harvested acres for grain is forecast at 86.8 million acres. That is up 4.7% from 2024. Now, the bottom table shows the top 5 states in terms of corn acreage for 2025 and how both planted and harvested acreage compared to last season. And then just as a reminder, 3.63 million acres of the total planted estimate were reported as left to be planted during the time of data collection. Now, looking at the planted and harvested corn numbers graphically across the past 10 years, you can see that this year's planted total is the highest across this particular time series. And in fact, this is the 3rd largest planted area since 1944, only behind 2012 and 2013. All right, next we'll take a look at the corn planted area by state. This first map compares the current estimate to the March intentions. Looking across the country, 35 states increased or are unchanged from their March intentions. We also see record high corn planted acres estimated in Idaho, Nevada, North Dakota, Oregon, and South Dakota. And we did have one record low in Rhode Island. Now, this map also highlights the corn planted area by state, but now we are comparing it to last year so that you can see the year-to-year changes. As you can see, there's a lot of blue on this map. In fact, 41 states increased corn acreage or are unchanged compared with last year. Seeing some fairly large percent changes in the Southeast and lower Mississippi Valley, mainly due to the reduction in cotton acres this year, which we will look at a little bit later in the presentation. Now, today's report also includes estimates for the percent of corn planted using biotech seed. As you can see on this chart, we don't see much change from year to year, and this year is no exception. Let's now look at how today's corn planted estimate compares to pre-report industry expectations. Now, for this chart, each blue dot represents an individual industry member's published expectation of corn planted area. The red square represents the NASS corn planted estimate of 95.2 million acres. As you can see, the NASS forecast for June falls in the middle of the range of expectations, so probably not much of a surprise with today's numbers. All right, next we'll move on to soybeans. Like we did for corn, we wanted to show how this year's planting progress compares to the previous 5 seasons. Again, the dark red line represents this year's planting pace. As you can see, planting ran ahead of the normal pace for most of the spring, which again indicates we had pretty good planting conditions in most parts of the country. Now, looking at the soybean acreage numbers in the report, planted acreage for 2025 is estimated at 83.4 million acres. This is down 0.1% or 115,000 acres from the March intentions, and down 4.2% or 3.67 million acres from the previous season. Harvested acreage is forecast at 82.5 million acres. That's down 4.1% from last year. And like we did for corn, we wanted to point out that 11.5 million acres of the planted estimate was left to be planted at the time we spoke to the farmers. Looking at soybean acres over time, you can see how this year's numbers compare to the previous 9 seasons. I do want to point out that despite the decrease from last year, this is the 8th highest planted area on record for the U.S. All right, next we'll look at the soybean planted acreage by state, comparing that back to our March intentions. You can see that in the Delta, acreage is down compared to March, mainly due to some wet weather conditions at times during that planting season. However, most of the reductions in those states were offset by excellent planting conditions in North Dakota, where soybean acreage is up 6.5% from March. And looking at the year-over-year changes, you can see that most of the states planted less soybean acres this year compared to last. All right, we also published the percent of soybean acres planted using biotech seed. And like we saw with corn, we see very little change year to year. Looking at how the soybean planted estimate compares to industry expectations, you can see that it too falls within the range. Now in June, we like to show the combined corn and soybean acreage by state and how that compares to both March intentions and last year. This first map is a comparison back to March. As you can see, the combined total of nearly 178.6 million acres is down 0.1% or 238,000 acres from the March intentions. We're looking at record high corn and soybean combined acreage in Idaho, Missouri, Nevada, Oregon, and South Dakota this year. And here's how those combined totals compared to the previous season, with the U.S. total up 0.5% from 2024. Now looking at the combined acreage total compared to the industry expectations, you can see that it too is within the range, but lower than some had anticipated. All right, next we'll look at U.S. cotton acres. Planted acreage is estimated at 10.1 million acres. This is up 2.6% or 253,000 acres from the March intentions, but down 9.5% or 1.06 million acres from last season. Now, as a reminder, we will publish our first forecast of 2025 harvested acres for cotton in the upcoming August crop production report. Now, looking at cotton acreage over time, you can see that this year's acreage is the lowest since 2016. Several factors are leading to this year's decline, including lower prices, higher input cost, and wet planting conditions in some areas of the growing region. Now, looking at the cotton planted acreage by state compared with the March intentions, you see a mixed bag. 7 states are up from the March intentions. One of those is Texas, which is up 199,000 acres for March, but 5 states are down and 5 show no change from the March intentions. Now, the 110,000 acres planted in Louisiana this year represents a record low for that state. However, they were at this same level back in 2021, so they are tying their record low. And then looking at year-over-year changes, this map is very similar to the one we looked at earlier for soybeans, in that most of the cotton producing states are down from the previous year. Looking at Texas, planted acreage is down 257,000 from last year. Now, we also published the percent of upland cotton acreage that was planted with biotech seed. And like we saw with both corn and beans, there is not much change from previous years. Now, unlike corn and beans, today's cotton estimate looked to be a surprise since it came in above the range of expectations. All right, looking at winter wheat, planted area at 33.3 million acres is up less then 0.1% or just 10,000 acres from the March estimate, but down 0.2% or 65,000 acres from the previous season. Now, harvested acreage at 24.8 million was lower at 3.5% or 888,000 acres from the previous forecast. And most of that decline came from Texas, which harvested acres were lowered 450,000, and Kansas, which was lowered 200,000. Then looking at harvested acres compared to last year, it's down 4.9% or 1.27 million acres. Now, looking at winter wheat acreage across time, you can see how it compares to the previous 9 seasons. Now, comparing the current planting estimates to what we published in March, as you can see, fairly small to no changes across most states. I just wanted to make you aware we are estimating record low winter wheat acreage in both California and Virginia. This map shows the year-over-year changes in winter wheat planted acres. Now, today's winter wheat planted estimate falls within the range of expectations, but may be slightly higher than some had anticipated. All right, moving on to other spring wheat. Planted area at just over 10 million acres is up 0.2% or 25,000 acres from the March intentions, but it's down 5.5% or 580,000 acres from the previous season. Harvested area at 9.75 million acres is down 5.7% from last year. Now, looking at this year's numbers compared to the previous 9 seasons, you can see it is the lowest in the series and continues the overall decline we have seen going back to 2018. And this represents the lowest planted acreage in the U.S. since 1970. Now, looking at the planted estimates on a state-by-state basis compared to our March intentions, you can see that except for Montana, all other states are down or unchanged. And then looking at the year-over-year change, all states are down except for South Dakota, that is equal to last year. Now, today's other spring wheat number should not be a surprise since it falls in the middle of the expectation. All right, now turning our focus to durum. Planted area at nearly 2.11 million acres is up 4.6% or 93,000 acres from the March intentions, and is up 2.1% from last year. Harvested acreage at 2.06 million is up 1.2% from the previous season. Looking at durum wheat acres over time, you can see this is the highest planted acreage total since 2017. Here we're looking at how the planted numbers compare to the March intentions, and then how they compare to the previous year. Today's durum estimate came in just above the range of expectations. All right, we do have quite a few other crops in the report, and I'll move through these fairly quickly. Barley planted acreage is up 1.8% from the previous year, while harvested area is up 2.2%. Canola planted acreage is down 13.2% from last year, but 2024 was a record high for that crop. And even with the decline, this represents the second highest planted and harvested area on record. Chickpea acreage planted at 540,000 is up 7.6% from last year and represents the highest acreage since 2018. Dry edible bean acreage is up 4.4% from last year, while dry edible peas are up 9.6% from 2024. And this is the highest planted and harvested acreage for this crop since 2019. Flaxseed acres are rebounding this year after being down for several years. Planted acreage in North Dakota, which is the largest producing state, increased 183 this year compared to last. Alfalfa harvested acres are down 2.9% for 2024, and we're looking at record low harvested acreage in California, Colorado, Tennessee, and Virginia this year. Other hay harvested acres are up 2.2% from last year. Lentils planted acreage is up 7.9% from the previous season, while harvested is up 6.8%. This represents the highest planted and harvested area for this crop since 2017. And then both planted and harvested acreage for mustard seed is down from last year, but still represents the 5th highest acreage on record. Now, oat planted acreage is up 3.3% from last year, while harvested is down 7%. Total harvested acreage for the U.S. is the third lowest on record, and we're looking at record low planted acreage in Maine, Oregon, New York, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Wisconsin for 2025. Now, peanut planted acreage at 1.9 million is up 5.5% or 99,000 acres from last year. This is the third straight year for increased peanut acreage, and it represents the highest planted and harvested area since 1991. Now, in Georgia, the largest peanut producing state, farmers planted 50,000 more acres this year compared to last. And then we're also seeing a record high peanut acreage in Arkansas. Now, potato planted acreage at 912,000 is down 1.9% from the previous season, while harvested area is down 2.1%. Now, this represents a record low planted and harvested area for the U.S. A record low planted area is estimated in California, Florida, Minnesota, and North Dakota this year. And then planted and harvested rapeseed acreage is up 14.9 and 14.6% respectively. This represents a record high level for both planted and harvested acreage. The U.S. planted rice acreage at 2.68 million acres is down 7.8% from last year. Now, compared to last season, 5 out of the 6 estimating states planted less rice. The only state increasing is California. In Arkansas, which is our largest rice producing state, farmers planted 187,000 acres less than they did in 2024. Planted rye acres at 2.42 million are up 9.5% from last year, and it's the highest level we've seen since 1987, while harvested acres for grain are down 4.2%. However, keep in mind that much of the planted area for this crop is used as a cover crop or feed, so it's not surprising to see planted and harvested area moving in different directions year over year. Safflower acreage is up 11.5% compared to last year, but it represents the third lowest planted area for the U.S. Sorghum planted area at 6.2 million acres is down 1.6% from last year, while harvested area is down 4.8%. Now, both planted and harvested sugar beet acreage are down 1.5% from the previous season, and this is the lowest planted area since 1983. Looking at sugarcane, harvested acreage is up 1.1% from 2024, and the harvested acreage in Louisiana is estimated at a record high for that state. We are seeing sharp increases in planted sunflower acreage this year. However, it does represent the fourth lowest total on record for the U.S. Acreage in North Dakota, the largest sunflower producing state, is up 173,000 acres from last year, but planted area in California, Colorado, and Kansas are all estimated at record lows. And then lastly, looking at tobacco, we continue to see the decline in acreage for this crop. It's down 0.9% from last year and represents a new record low for the U.S. These next few slides gives you an overview of what we have discussed today and how it all fits together. Now, this first slide shows those 22 principal crops sorted from largest to smallest acreage to see how they compare with each other. This next chart is showing the acreage changes from our March intentions. The data is sorted from the largest increases, which are at the top of the chart, to the largest decreases at the bottom. Now, this chart is comparing acreage changes to the previous year as a percentage. Again, we're sorting it by the largest percent increases to the largest percent decreases. And then this is the last slide we have on the acreage report today. It's similar to the slide we just looked at, but now we are showing the actual acreage change from 2024 instead of the percentage change like we did on the prior slide. All right, let's now transition over to our stock estimates that we released today. We'll start with all wheat stocks. Now, as a reminder, June represents the ending stocks for wheat and the other small grains. As of June 1st, all wheat stocks totaled nearly 851 million bushels. That is up 22.1% from the same time last year. On-farm stocks are up 32% year over year, while the off-farm portion is up 19.6%. This graphic gives you a nice visual of what's happening with the crop over the season. The blue vertical bars represent the beginning supply for each crop year. The four horizontal lines represent the 4 quarterly stock estimates we published during the season. And then at the bottom, the gold bar represents the June quarter. Now, looking at the beginning supply of 2.67 billion bushels, that was up 12.4% from the previous season. And the March to May disappearance of 386 million bushels is down 1.6% from the same period a year earlier. Now, looking at how the all wheat stocks compare with the published expectations, you can see it is within the range, but higher than most had anticipated. All right, next we'll look at the June 1 corn stocks, which represents the third quarter stocks for this crop. As of June 1st, total stocks are estimated at 4.64 billion bushels. That is down 7.1% from the same time last year. On-farm stocks are down 15.5% from the previous June, while off-farm stocks are up 5.9% from the same time last year. Now, looking at the same chart we looked at for wheat, we can see that the beginning supply of corn for the 24-25 crop year was 16.6 billion bushels, which was down 0.4% from the prior season. The March to May disappearance of 3.5 billion bushels is up 4.4% from the same period a year earlier. Now, today's corn stock estimates fall in the middle of expectations, so it should not come as a surprise. All right, next we'll look at the June soybean stocks, which, like corn, June represents the third quarter of the year. As of June 1st, total stocks are estimated at 1.01 billion bushels. This is up 3.9% from the same time last year. On-farm stocks are down 11.7% from the previous June, while off-farm stocks are up 18.2%. Now, beginning supply of soybeans for the 24-25 crop year was 4.71 billion bushels, which was up 6.4% from the prior season. And the March to May disappearance of 903 million bushels is up 3.3% from the same period last year. Now, looking at how today's soybean stocks estimates compared with published expectations, you can see that it is within the range, but somewhat higher than most were expecting. Now, we also released our June rice stocks report today, which shows June 1 rough rice stocks totaling 69.7 million hundredweight. That's up 14.7% from the previous June. On-farm stocks are up 94.4% from the previous June, while off-farm stocks are up 7% from the same time last year. Now, looking at this next graphic, the beginning supply of rice of 255 million hundredweight was 5.3% higher than the previous season, and the March to May disappearance of 31.4 million hundredweight is down 28.8% from the same period last year. All right, let's now look at some of the other commodities in today's grain stocks report. We'll start with barley at 69.5 million bushels. That is down 11.1% from the same time last year. Looking at canola, stocks are up 14% from last June and actually represents a record high for the June quarter. Chickpea stocks are up 36.2% from the same time last year. Dry edible pea stocks are up 28%. Flaxseed stocks, however, are down 39.3% from the same time last year, and lentil stocks are up 90.3% from last June. June 1 oat stocks at 29.9 million bushels are down 17.4% from the previous year. Rye stocks are down 5.6%. Sorghum stocks at 99.5 million bushels are up sharply from a year earlier. And lastly, durum wheat stocks at 27.9 million bushels are up 32.5% from the previous year. All right, and this slide just highlights a few of the upcoming reports that we have in July. Tomorrow, we'll be releasing our 3 CARES reports. We'll be back here on July 11th for the next crop production report. July 25th, we'll be releasing cattle on feed, and farm production expenditures. And then wrapping up the month, releasing the agricultural prices on July 31st. Now, as mentioned earlier, Lance will be on X at 1:30 today for Stat Chat, fielding any questions about the estimates in today's reports. So this concludes the 2025 Acreage grain stocks and rice stocks briefing. Now, as a reminder, today's report and all NASS reports and data can be found on our website at www.nass.usda.gov. And again, I want to thank everyone in attendance today, as well as those joining us